All right, we're live.
Hi, I'm Doreen Marshall, Vice President of Mission Engagement with the American Foundation for Suicide Prevention. We're here today to talk about protecting your mental health during the time of the coronavirus. And I'm joined by Jackie Padilla of NowThis. Hi, Jackie.
Hi, good to see you again. I'm glad that we have this weekly get together. It's a great opportunity to talk about mental health, and I know myself and our audience are definitely filled with questions while we're all experiencing some sort of lockdown. And we've touched on the topics we're going to speak about today a little bit, but I think we want to go more in depth about grief and motivation to try to overcome any obstacles that we're facing. So in terms of grief, how have you seen that evolve from the first week of lockdown experiences, and now we're quite a few weeks into this process?
I think it's such an important question. So part of what I think has changed since the early weeks is certainly, the more people have died from the coronavirus, and many of us are experiencing that grief. But in addition to that, I think what started to set in for many of us is the realization that things aren't going to go back to exactly the way they were before all of this. And so I think in addition to the lives lost, we're also grieving missed opportunities. We're grieving kind of looking ahead that life may look different for us. And I think it's been a lot of change in a short amount of time. And that's something that I think all of us are grappling with, just how much things have changed, and really just kind of a loss of what many of us in the grief world call a loss of our assumptive world, meaning the things we assume are going to happen day to day, the things we assume we're going to be able to do. I think many of us are struggling with this idea of lots has changed for us, and we may not know what's going to happen or how we're going to go forward differently.
What kind of emotions might we be experiencing if we can't, right away recognize that it's called grief? Is it anger or sadness or this feeling of being alone? How can someone identify that?
I think grief is complicated like that, in that even moment to moment we can feel different emotions. So we may find, some days or some parts of the day we're feeling more frustrated or angry. Other days we may feel sad, lonely. We might even feel some relief in the mix of all of this. And I know that sounds like a strange emotion, but let's say, you were someone who really had a difficult commute and suddenly you're not doing that anymore. There can be some relief in that. Gee, I don't have to get up so early. I don't have to, rush out of my house. So I think the grief that comes, there's a lot of different emotions that are packed into it. And for many of us, it may also trigger previous grief, meaning if we've had other losses in our life, particularly ones that may have been pretty profound or recently, we might find that we're thinking more about those losses as well right now.
And so how do you cope with that, especially if experiencing intense grief, already puts you at risk of self-harm, or somebody who might already be at risk? How do we navigate that, and how do we cope better with it if it's already a struggle to begin with?
I think an important thing to remember is that for many of us, loss brings lots of feelings. And for a lot of us, those feelings or what we know about loss comes from loss that we had no say in, right? Or loss that happened to us, but that we didn't choose. So one of the things that I've been encouraging people to do is really separate out what's in your control about what's currently happening and what isn't. And so some of that, and an important piece of that, is in the midst of these changes, I think looking for the things that maybe we feel okay about, and really not making the current situation be a kind of loss that we have no say in. So for example, Many of us are having to find new ways to connect with our friends and all of that. And I will say for myself, the conversations have actually been at a deeper level than if we were just out somewhere or spending time in that way. Having to do things via Zoom is much more intentional, and it's led to some deeper conversations. So I guess the bigger picture on this is to think about the things that are in our control, but also to focus on the parts of the grief that we do have some say in. Knowing that we didn't choose this, but that there are many things that we can still choose even within the sadness, the frustration that we're feeling.
And I think another obstacle, especially when it comes with loss, is not having access to, funerals or some sort of way to get closure right now. So what's your best piece of advice for somebody dealing with that extra obstacle that, what used to be such a traditional way to get closure and to confront it and to, healthily deal with this is no longer an option?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we can say enough that as human beings, we like rituals around grief. They bring us a sense of completeness. They help us say goodbye to our loved ones. And so for many of us that may have lost someone and not having the ability to engage in a funeral or to engage in even for those you haven't lost, but you just can't make contact in the same way. I think what's important is to find new rituals. And so when we think about, for example, the ritual of a funeral, and that so many of us are unable to even attend funerals at this point, I think thinking about ways to honor that relationship, to say or express the things about the person that you loved. So, for example, there's lots of online memorial sites. We have for suicide loss, we have a digital quilt on our site. But finding ways to kind of acknowledge and remember your loved one. And then I think that, a big piece of processing loss for us is really reflecting on what that relationship meant to us. And I do think, whether you're somebody that looks at that in terms of experiences, I think the more we can connect with those who also are remembering the person, even if that's virtual, that's email, tell a story about the person you lost that was meaningful to you. I think doing those things still helps us process. Knowing that at some point down the line, there may be a way to have a ritual that feels more full for us.
Something we've been doing at NowThis is a weekly obituary, remembering people across the world who have had a confirmed case of the coronavirus. And some people, I think it would be easy to think, the more we keep seeing this and the more we talk about so much death, it can be a bit morbid. But are you saying that it's almost like a necessary way to cope and to talk about it openly?
Yeah, one of the things I wrote in the blog that I wrote recently was looking at kind of death in this sense of that the last few sentences of a story don't rewrite the whole book. And so I think thinking about the person's life and thinking about what they meant to us, it can be really hard to do that right away with I think some of the fear and things that come with the coronavirus. But really, when we acknowledge grief, we acknowledge the fullness of those relationships. And that's the things we loved about the person. That's the things that drove us crazy about the person. It's all of those things. And that, I think, acknowledging those different facets of the person we lost can really be helpful versus looking at it just through the lens of the loss. The other thing I would say is that I really believe that some of how we connect in life is about holding intentions for people. So whether you're someone who's spiritual or not, almost doesn't matter. I think you can still hold an intention for someone that you've lost. So one of the ones that I use is, may you be at peace and feel my love for you. And those kinds of things, I think, even helping us connect to the person that we've lost in that way can really help us and ground us that we're doing something to move through our grief.
And, we've already mentioned that there are resources out there to have these conversations and to address all of the things that we're feeling. But I'm curious how you explain the process to somebody who's never reached out for help. We have the Suicide Prevention Lifeline, which is 800-273-8255, or the crisis text line where you can text TALK to 741-741. But where does that conversation start? Can you paint a picture for me of what those conversations look like for someone who might be hesitant to reach out in the first place?
I think that's really important. So I think there's a few things. I think if you're struggling with grief right now and it's leading you to a feeling of hopelessness, or if you're feeling overwhelmed by your feelings and even having thoughts of suicide related to any of this experience, I think reaching out to the crisis line, you don't have to be all the way in the midst of a terrible crisis to reach out. And so what happens is you call, you get someone on the line who's a trained person, trained to listen. We'll probably ask you some questions, but also give you an opportunity to express whatever it is that you're experiencing right now. And the crisis lines have gotten calls from folks experiencing all sorts of emotions related to what we're going through right now. So I would encourage you, if you're feeling alone, or if you're feeling like, gee, there's no one I can really talk to about this, where I can just get out all of these emotions that I'm feeling, making that call really will just connect you to a conversation with someone trained to listen, and someone who can help you work through some of the things you're feeling in the moment that may be overwhelming or leading to a real feeling of hopelessness.
And for many, some just need the motivation to make that call or text in the first place. So where does that motivation start? Where is it, making a goal or having a mantra? What's your best advice to start making that motivation grow to better yourself?
I will say, I think many people call the crisis line or the crisis text line just to even see how it works. And I think that's an okay thing to do. As somebody who's been a therapist in my life, I've often called the number just to kind of see what the experience would be like, so I can advise people. And what I will tell you is to just make that step, that if you're worried that it's going to, making that call is going to trigger some series of events that you don't have any say in, that's not what's going to happen. What is going to happen is you're going to get someone on the other line who's going to be caring, compassionate, and really want to just hear from you. And these lines are fielding calls all day, 24/7 right now, and hearing from lots of folks that are in a similar place. So I think the encouragement is to just try it. And I think what you'll find is that it's a helpful support that's there for you, and that you can reach out to whenever you need.
And when we're discussing grief and motivation and healing, where does fear play a factor in all of this?
Well, certainly many of us that have lost someone during this time may have fear that we will lose others. We may have fear that we'll be unable to cope, or that more loss will happen to us. We will get sick. Those kinds of fears. And I think the one thing about fear is that while it often starts grounded in some concern that's normal, valid, usual, we can easily find ourselves catastrophizing or getting really far ahead with our fears. So we may be worrying not only about the immediate moment, but about 6 months from now or 3 months from now. And so what's often helpful is to just ground ourselves in the moment and realize that fear, while a very normal emotion right now, doesn't predict the future. And just because we feel afraid doesn't mean we won't be able to feel afraid and cope. I think if you look at stories in history where leaders and others have had to go through very difficult times, what you'll find is those times weren't in the absence of being afraid. But that fear alone, as long as we can contain it to the moment that we're facing and not get too far ahead of ourselves, can really help us. It can tune us in to what we need to do for ourselves to feel safe.
And a big part of that is just adapting, which clearly is just in our human nature to do. How do you think we've been doing as a society adapting to all this?
Well, again, like I mentioned a few moments ago, we have faced an inordinate amount of change in a very short period of time with little to no kind of preparation emotionally for this. I think for many of us, it felt like things stopped very suddenly and we had to adapt quickly. And I think what we'll find is that most of us did adapt and probably aren't giving ourselves credit for just how much we've adapted so far. And so, one thing I think is that if we can just remember that we got to this point today by adapting over the last month, 6 weeks, however long it's been for you, where you've been experiencing profound change as a result of this. And we will continue to adapt. Like you mentioned, Jackie, it's in our nature as human beings to adapt. We adapt to things all the time and really don't even notice that we're adapting. And this is going to, the other thing I should say is that we get really creative as human beings. It's part of what makes us really unique, is that we find new ways to adapt all the time. And I have no doubt that part of how we do that is in community, which is why it's important to talk to other people via Skype, to stay connected, to do those things, because I do think while we're facing similar scenarios, some of us may have ideas that others haven't thought of how better to adapt. And the more we can continue to share and stay connected, the better we're all going to be as we get through this.
Well, again, I really appreciate you taking time to chat with me. I think all of these conversations that we're having on a weekly basis are so important. And, there's so many people who are feeling the same things. And I think if we can just express that we're in this together, we're doing this together, you're not alone, is really the highlight from all of this. Would you say that, there's reassurance and just knowing that all the things someone's feeling at home is something probably your next door neighbor is feeling too?
Absolutely. And I'm a kind of a silver lining kind of person. You probably gathered that about me. And I think one of the things that I've noticed in my conversations with people is that my conversations are much more real now, right? There's like a shared vulnerability that we all have. And in a way, it breaks down some walls. And I think for folks who may, before the pandemic, may have felt very alone in what they were feeling, or may have felt they were more vulnerable than others when it came to emotions, I think just the fact that some of these walls are coming down and that we are sharing more authentically is going to lead us all to a better outcome for our mental health and for our relationships with each other. So that's my silver lining. I think that if you're feeling vulnerable, sharing that vulnerability, what you're going to find is that others are too. And some of that makes for more authentic and real conversations that will continue as we go forward.
I think that's a great point. I think we all need to keep in mind our silver lining, whatever that may be, but I think you definitely just said it best. And again, I want to thank you for taking time to chat with us. We'll have another conversation with AFSP next week. But again, if you need to reach out to somebody, the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline is 800-273-8255, or you can text the crisis line by texting TALK to 741-741. Thank you again, Dr. Marshall. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Jackie. Mm-hmm.